Hi everyone. The lesson is Instance Variables Part 1 in Objective-C. We will be using these tools and references in this lecture. You need to make sure you look at Part 3 of Properties Part 3, Property Attributes before this, and you can find the link in the description. You'll be learning about what are instance variables, properties versus instance variables, and that most properties are backed by instance variables, why you need instance variables, and that you can define instance variables without properties. Lesson plan, as usual, it's going to be practical demonstrations. So let's refer the document, developer docs. It straight away talks about instance variables, but let's take step by step, right? So what are instance variables in first place? So to understand what are instance variables, let's look at properties now. By now you are aware that there are properties in a class. So for example, in this employee class, you got 4 properties. So, well, the implementation is nothing, so it's empty. So then we declare the object and we can access the properties. So properties are the most advanced way of dealing with data. So for example, you can see it is best practice to use a property on an object anytime you need to keep a track of value or another object. So anytime you need to keep a track of value, it's the best practice is to use properties. So when you say keep a track of a value, what it means is this. Now say you want to keep a track of employee John. That means you want to keep a track of value. So this is the meaning of keeping a track of a value. So say employee E1 is John. So John's data. Then let's say employee 2, right? Let's say once you declare employee 1, I will copy this. I will put it here, and let's say employee E2, right? Then object E2, 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 E2. Let's say employee number 2. Let's say this is Anne. Let's say Anne is 30 years old, and let's say Anne's annual salary is 40,000. So now I'm keeping a track of data, right? In object E1, I'm keeping a track of, let's say, employee name, age, salary. So in object E1, I'm keeping a track of John's data. In object E2, I'm keeping a track of Anne's data. So inside the object, if you need to keep a track of data, let's run this first to see. So I'm expecting to get data of Anne and John. As you can see it works. Employee number 1, John. So this is keeping track of data. So anytime you need to keep a track of data, the best practice is to use properties. That's what the developer docs recommends. However, if you need to define your own instance variables without declaring a property, you can add them inside braces at the top of the class, interface, or implemented. So however, if you need instance variables, this is how you declare them. Now this is how you declare properties. Then this is how you declare instance variables, either at the top of the interface or at the top of the implementation, but you have to do it within curly brackets, within braces. So within curly brackets. So if you see something like this within curly brackets at the top of the interface or at the top of the implementation, that means you are declaring instance variables. Now the question is, what are instance variables, right? Now to answer that, let's discuss about properties versus instance variables. Now, so when you have properties, so the properties is the best way, best practice of opening your data to the outside world. So plus if you want to keep hold of data, the best, so that when you have properties, they are public, and then the properties can be accessed by outside programs like this, right? But now let's say if you are declaring instance variables, let's first declare instance variable. As it says, what you have to do is in the interface, you have to put curly braces. Now, let's say, for example, I want to keep hours worked. Hours work. Let's say, as example, I want to keep it as an instance variable. So let us put a comment and say instance variables, right? Instance variables. Now, I can declare many. Let's say hours worked and hourly rate. For example, int hourly rate. I'm just giving example. Hours worked and hourly rate. So let's let's see what are these instance variables. Now, so once you declare instance variables, let's see whether you can access them from outside, right? So let's say hours worked. So from the main method, if I say e1 dot hours work, it's not coming, which means it's not accessible. So instance variables are not accessible using the dot notation. But there's another notation where you can access certain instance variables by using this notation, but still hours work is not accessible even through that notation. So even if I say hours worked is 10, I will be getting an error telling instance variable hours worked is protected. So what that means is when you declare instance variables, they cannot be accessed from outside the class. So if you declare instance variable inside employee class, it's accessible only inside the employee class. So from inside employee class, you can access the instance variables, right? So let's say, for example, in the employee class, let's say I want to have a method called, let's put a method, let's say void, I'm just giving example, void, let's say calculate salary. I'm just giving example, right? Calculate salary. Now from this calculate salary method, if I go to the implementation, right, from the calculate salary method, I can access, let's say self. If I want to access the property, I will have to say self dot salary. As you know, I can't just access salary, because if I just access salary, yes, I can, but it's accessing the internal synthesize instance variable for the property salary. Let's do that. So when I say salary, I can access it, but it's underscore salary, because as you know, whenever you have properties, there will be automatically the properties are backed by instance variables, meaning every property will have a automatically generated instance variable which is the same name as the instance variable name will be same as the name of the property, but it will have underscore in front. So for salary, I will get automatically underscore salary. So it's referring to the corresponding instance variable corresponding to the salary. In other words, it's accessing the salary. So if I change the salary here, and if from outside, if someone accesses the salary, the value will be reflected. Anyhow, so for salary, I can say, now one more thing. As the best practice, when you declare instance variable, the best practice is, it's not a rule, but it's the best practice is to proceed it with the underscore. Because in Objective-C, instance variables, best practice is to put an underscore in front, so that when you look at it, you know it's an instance variable. Of course, they are instance variables, but whenever you use it from some other places, such as from a method, the moment you see, let's say if you want to access hourly rate, the moment you type, when you see underscore hourly rate, you know it's an instance variable, right? Then if you say hours worked, right, then you know underscore hours worked, but I declare it. That's the best practice. So let's compile this product build, right? So I'm getting a build failed error. Let's see why it is. So I don't see the error here. So then if you want to see the error, easiest thing is look at here, look at the issue navigator, click on it. Then you can see, yeah, the error is this. As I said earlier, you can't access. So let's comment it, because instance variables are not accessible from outside. Let's compile now once again. Build success, right? Then once again go here. So So now, okay, you can see that I have written a code with instance variables. But the question is, why do we need instance variables? Well, now, as you saw, it said the best practice is to use properties. So actually speaking, the best practice is not to use instance variables, right? So the best practice is to use properties. But however, if you want, you can have instance variables. Now, properties are like global variables for the class, right? Yeah. So you mean properties can be accessed from anywhere in the class in the implementation by any method. Same instance variables. Instance variables are also global variables within the class which can be accessed from anywhere inside the class. So both properties and instance variables act in a similar manner inside a class. They both are global. The difference is instance variables are accessible only inside the class. But properties are accessible from both inside the class, meaning from inside the implementation, plus from outside. So that's one difference, right? If you want to know a difference, that is one difference. The other difference is the recommended approach is to use properties, not instance variables, right? And also one thing to recall once again is every property is automatically backed by instance variable. For example, salary is having auto synthesize, meaning when you say automatically backed, we call it as auto synthesize. It's auto synthesize into underscore salary. So actually speaking, when you have properties inside the class, they are represented using instance variables. So even you don't declare instance variables, when you have properties, there is automatically synthesized instance variables. So the question is, what are instance variables? So every property also got an instance variable. So there are 4 instance variables automatically synthesized for these 4 properties. So what are instance variables? Whether you declare them like this or whether they are auto-synthesized instance variables coming through properties. What are instance variables? Instance variables means if you got an object, E1, another word for object is an instance. So E1 is an instance of employee. E2 is instance of employee. So E1 instance, when you create a E1, it has its own instance variables for itself, and E2 will have its own instance variables for itself. For example, when you create a E1, because there are 4 properties, then for each of the property you are storing some data. So this data has to be kept separate. So that is why for these properties, there will be auto-synthesized instance variables, because in memory, when you create an object, its data has to be kept inside separate variables. So John's data should be separate from Anne's data. So how that separation is done is through instance variables. So every object will have its own instance variables. So whether you declare them explicitly or whether it comes automatically through properties, at the end of the day, the meaning is when you create an object, the data will be kept throughout the life cycle of that object. So when object is created, the data is kept throughout the life cycle of the object inside instance variables of that object. So E1 will have its instance variables throughout the life cycle of that object. But of course, from outside, you are accessing them as properties, but internally they will be kept as instance variables, right? So that is what. So at the end of the day, whether you explicitly declare instance variables or not, or if you use properties, still there will be instance variables. But the best practice is you don't explicitly declare instance variables. You always try to deal with them as properties. Awesome. So now you got some idea about what are instance variables and what are the properties versus instance variables, and also that you now understand most properties are backed by instance variable auto synthesized, right? Then why do you need instance variables? That was you understood to a certain extent, right? And also you can define instance variables without properties. That also you understand, because if you want, you can define instance variables. Then finally, once again, why do you need instance variables? Another reason for that is when you declare properties, properties are by default accessible from outside. But as you see, instance variables are not accessible from outside. So if you need some data to the class, which you need the data to be global to the class, which can be accessed by all the methods, and if you want that data not to be accessible from outside the class. So I will repeat one more time. Let's say you need a variable which need to be global, meaning it should be accessible throughout all the methods in the class, but you don't want that variable to be accessible from outside. So then better you can make it an instance variable rather than making it a property, because when you make a property, it's accessible from outside as well. So instance variables will be a choice for that scenario what I said. So when you declare instance variable, it's accessible within the class globally, but not available for outside. So if that is what you want, then you can use an instance variable to achieve that task, right? Awesome. So with that, you got to know about instance variables, but mostly you will see we will be using properties, and once in a while maybe instance variables as well. So that completes the lesson of instance variables. So we discussed a practical lesson about instance variables. Conclusion, you learn about these points, and you can find the link to download the source code for the practicals done in the description. We use Apple Developer Docs. So have a look at our other videos for practicals on Objective-C, and we are very excited to see you in our next video. So see you in our next video.